everyone, I'm Daniela Ellerbeck, an attorney and the manager of the FW de Klerk Foundation's Constitutional Rights Program. Today, we're in for a treat on a wonderful discussion about electoral reform following the Electoral Reform Consultation Panel's 2 reports. Joining me is my colleague Ismail, Joosub, as well as Honourable Mmusi from the Build One South African Party, commonly known as BOSA, and Mr. Mohau Lecheko.
Good day, everyone. My name is Mohau. I am a person who has a keen interest in the subject of electoral reform. I also am a salesperson by profession.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ismail Joosub. I'm the FW de Klerk Foundation's Manager of Constitutional Advancement.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Mmusi Maimane. I chair the Standing Committee on Appropriations and I lead Build One South Africa.
So those of you joining us today will know that the FW de Klerk Foundation has been running a series on electoral reform and why it is important. So electoral systems basically dictate how votes in an election are turned into parliamentary seats. In other words, who gets the seats in parliament. Now, we have discussed previously that there are 2 main systems. The one is a proportional representation system, which is what South Africa had from 1994 onwards and which was supposed to be a temporary system. Now, PR system means that if Ismail, for example, got 40% of the votes, he gets 40% of the seats in parliament. That is wonderful in terms of fairness and in terms of simplicity, but it does mean that Ismail is accountable to his political party leader as opposed to the voters, which has given rise to what is commonly known as the accountability problem. Now, the other major system, known as the first past the post system, means that you only elect a leader for a specific geographic area, and that geographic area gets a seat in parliament. So it's a head-on-head competition with the person who wins the most seats passing the post and getting the seat. And this means that you have a representative tie to a specific geographic area, and it is wonderful in terms of being able to hold your representative accountable. However, you do lose some of the fairness that comes with the PR system. Now, South Africa's constitution dictates that we need to achieve overall proportionality. So the system we adopt has to have some form of PR in it. But the biggest debate has been on how to reform the current system so that it is fairer for individual candidates. And importantly, how do we fix the accountability problem? Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. Dr. Maimane, perhaps let's start with you. The Electoral Reform Panel has now given 2 reports, the original report and an alternative report, also known as the Minority Report and the Majority Report, with a 4-5 divide in the panel of 9. What are your views about what the recommendations in these reports are?
Firstly, I think it's worth reminding everybody this is not a fresh conversation. It's a fairly old conversation. President Mandela understood the fact that there'd be a need for reform. Ismail tabled a report that spoke to this issue. The high-level panel report by Kgalema Motlanthe has raised this issue. Even recently, President Mbeki has spoken to electoral reform. So that you now have taken the process when we post the successful court judgment by Madlanga, which effectively argued that the Electoral Act must be brought back to Parliament for its own amendment, and that Parliament then took a malicious compliance to the Constitution to that judgment and produced an electoral system that others would say just simply included independence and did nothing to electoral reform, tells you how when you've got a political party like the ANC, they're simply not interested in accountability. That's a start. And the amendments really must speak to the question of accountability. Now you have a panel who, again, has sat through a number of years. I think firstly, it's a failure of the chairperson. Can't chair a report and then table 2 dividing report, which was not your original mandate to start off with. And even if it were, at least at some point, the role of a chairperson needs to be one where you produce a report that is able to guide members of parliament or guide the executive as to what decisions they need to make. So I think that's poor form. Secondly, that ultimately you've got 2 reports that are now wanting to ask for parliament to choose between which one in an inherently divided political process is really kicking the can famously down the road. And I think, to me, as South Africans, we ought to take great issue with how this process has been handled up to this point. What cannot be debated, at least after state capture, that President Ramaphosa himself at the state capture report said, South Africa is an anomaly in this regard. There's no direct election of the president. This, to me, tells me that the leaders talk, but ultimately Parliament either doesn't do its job, or what they say in public and what they say to their parties are 2 different things. I would argue, rather than us trying to entertain these reports, entertain the process as if these are just flaws of delays and differing opinions, I would argue they are deliberate actions by people seeking to sabotage electoral reform. Therefore, as citizens, we can't sit here and say, well, let's hope that the committee finds each other and they come back with a report. We need electoral reform. We've been through state capture. It must be a combination of a constituency-based model and proportional representation, which Ismail had proposed anyways, whether it's 350-50 or 200-200. That's a better debate to have. But at the end of the day, really, I think that we're dealing with a bunch of people who don't want accountability and are playing us along, as it were. And I think if we sit here and entertain them, then they would feel that their game is working well. I think we should all really put our foot down, take whatever activism action that we need to take, and simply come down to a point where we say we can't wait until 2029, because I can tell you now we'll be sitting in 2028 still arguing whether it's one report or another, whereas the global experience has taught us the strengths, the weaknesses of each of the two models in the first place. South Africa must choose its own medicine and take it and prepare for 2029.
Mohau, how can we make this a political issue? I mean, Mmusi is 100% correct in my view, where this is, I think, the 5th time that we've been around the same subject as a country and still no reform has been implemented. The only reform we have seen is to allow independent candidates to participate, and the system that was adopted is very unfair towards them. And this was only after a constitutional court told Parliament to change the system to allow independent candidates to participate. In your view, what can we do to make this a political issue so that the politicians have to listen to the voters and change the system?
Look, Daniela, this problem, you're right. It is a political issue. It's not technical, although the experts would like to make it technical. If you to read those two reports, actually the second one, this alternative report, you will be flabbergasted by the technicalities that are in that. It needs a qualified actuary to understand. And it's one of the biggest problems that we have here, and why I think the general public is not interested in this particular topic and don't understand it, is because the experts are flabbergasting the public with technicalities. Now, Dr. Maimane is right. This is not the first time we're having this debate. It started during the transition. It was such a big debate that it was decided that we will start with the PR system, and then after the election, we'll have a formal parliamentary process that will evaluate what is the best electoral system for South Africa. There's two choices. I know there's technicalities under those particular choices, but the two choices are PR or constituency-based system. There was a formal process done by Parliament. It published a report in 2003. That report is called the Van Zyl-Slabbert report. It had a majority recommendation, and the recommendation was we should have a constituency-based system in South Africa. That was the recommendation by that panel, that parliamentary process. Right? It went to Parliament. The ANC rejected that. They wanted to side with the minority recommendation, which is continue the PR system. So the issue that we're dealing here is not if we don't know the advantages or disadvantages. It's a political decision that the ANC has been on for the last 30 years. The ANC has been blocking this thing of constituencies that was recommended by the Van Zyl-Slabbert report. Now, come 2024, and we have a new panel that discussed the very, very same issue. The issue here is not the technicalities of the system. We know what is the outcomes of both electoral systems. The issue here is that the ANC has been blocking this thing for the last 30 years. What's even ironic now is if you to look at the composition of this panel, I mean, there's an advocate there who was in the minority report back in 2003, who is part of this particular panel. The interesting thing for me is what the second report is trying to do is to cancel out that original Van Zyl-Slabbert so-called majority report. Because a lot of us who have been activists for electoral reform always refer to the Van Zyl-Slabbert report as the majority recommendation that we should be aligning ourselves to. The ANC has been rejecting it for the last 30 years. This was a very opportune time for them to come with their own majority report. If you look at those people there who are part of this majority report that we're talking about, some of them were members of legislature in KZN. We cannot legitimize a report like that. We cannot. I think this is the principle here. The public needs to know and needs to be able to sift through the technicalities of what is happening here. The issue that we have is accountability. No electoral system is perfect. The electoral system is not a moral system. It does not come from above or from God. It is a system that a particular population chooses based on its need. As Dr. Maimane has said there, we have been having a problem of an unaccountable government. That is why we have a sitting president who can stand up before the nation and say the ANC comes before the nation. He is correct. He is correct because his political career, his survival, is dependent on his standing in the party, not if he pleases the citizens. So this electoral system that we have, in fact, the question around how can we make people participate in our electoral system, that's the answer. If we to change this to a constituency-based system, then this means the following in practical terms. There is a person in a jurisdiction who is a member of parliament who's elected directly by people in a particular jurisdiction. That person has to go and feed back to its constituency on a regular basis. So people living in a particular jurisdiction will know that my member of parliament is coming to feed back on a particular issue, on the work of parliament on a particular day. It is a structured system that is accountable. That member of parliament also has the responsibility of giving the community or the constituency a view of what we will be discussing in parliament, or what is the work of parliament in the coming months or so, whatever the case may be. It is his job to get the mandate from the people that will then he will align with once he's doing the work of parliament. That system where there is a particular location where a person has to sit and speak to the people. That is how we bring people back into the electoral system. The reason why people are not participating in the electoral system is because they can scream and shout and protest, but their voices are not heard. If the ANC does not move, the country does not move, and that's the issue. So the electoral system and us altering it and changing it and bringing in constituencies is exactly what we need to bring back people back into our electoral system.
Dr. Maimane, in your view, what can we do to actually make this a political issue going forward with the elections? How can we exert pressure to actually get the electoral system to change? Because, as you've said, we have been around this bush so many times, and it feels like we just keep going around and around it as a country. But those with the power to change the system are the ones who don't want to change it.
I think a point that has been made that if the ANC doesn't move, then the system is also blockaded. Firstly, I really do think we need to take a multiple step approach here. The first is we need to force the Committee of Home Affairs, and citizens need to march onto that committee and ensure that their submissions are heard, because this is where the draft legislation is being dealt with, and that committee needs to be able to do its job. I wonder whether there isn't a legal question that must be put here to say delaying this just matter is denying the previous court judgment, because in essence, when I say malicious compliance, it is exactly that. It did nothing for accountability, and instead it made it impossible for independence to stand. The third is that the political parties that agree on this matter, and some have preferred to be silent. At some level, I'm not here. The DA has kept quiet on this issue. Yet they are inside the GNU. I'm a bit baffled why, when people who stood distinctly for particular policies, when they are given Mercedes-Benzes and security, decide to forego those principles. Now, we've all agreed. Here's an electoral reform, so we need to vote to make sure that we get parties who are going to advance this issue. Because at the end of the day, you need a president who will sign this into law, and you need a committee and a parliament who will agree on the majority of the issue. So if we don't get it by 2029, forget panels. Forget this laborious process. I'm honestly, I feel like you have politicians who are literally saying to the public, they are pretending to do something. Get onto the business of making sure that we do that. And for every matter that we have seen, what the problem with it is that the government knows one truth. When citizens are divided, whether it's business, whether it's civil society, etc., once they're divided, they know they can railroad an issue. We need to put our collective efforts together and set aside our egos and realize that the struggle here must be one fought as a collective. And so whether you're from a civil society, whatever political party, we need to unite around this issue and get it right. Otherwise, it is forever going to be, others will say, no, it's an issue for this party or that party. It is an existential issue for democracy in the country. And so ultimately, this issue of accountability. Imagine if you had an MP who must go back to the people of Tembisa and explain to them what happened to that hospital. It would be a totally different conversation. But instead now, we leave everything to processes. No, it's the ANC's way of governing. We don't know what's happening. We've set up a committee to investigate what happens. We don't know what's going on with the police. We're going to have an ad hoc committee or a Matlanga commission. We don't know what's going on. Actually, the electoral system must be able to ensure that somebody must come and answer. So that when they go vote, I can tell you now, when they go vote in parliament and your constituency is in demand of that hospital in Tembisa, then your vote will mean something. But at this point, it is meaningless because the party can dictate to you what you want to do. So it's the intersect between, that's why I always say to people, some of what I think how you've put it so eloquently, you can make it technical, but when it's said and done, we must simplify it for the user. What is the user looking for? The user is looking for a person to hold accountable for the problems they have. That's democracy. So let's make it easier for the user and say, if you do this, that's what you get. And let's mobilize society around it, because the technicalities obfuscate the issue and only make it an elite issue. Whereas even the poorest citizens know and understand that they vote for their ward councillor, and if the ward councillor doesn't do anything, they take action against the ward councillor. Now, if they can understand what a ward councillor does, why can't they understand an MP in a constituency-based model?
If I may jump in, I think, Mmusi, two of the biggest problems in our democracy is that the youth who make up the largest portion of the demographic are often the least to turn out to vote on voting day. in the national and provincial elections. And I think this is also because of a sense of complacency amongst young people to say, but the system hasn't changed. The people in the system are not even accountable to the voters themselves, but rather to political parties and pander to party bosses. Therefore, why should we waste our time to go out and vote? I think that's a huge problem. I think the other problem is the rumor, or not even a rumor, it might be true, that gets touted that says that the real power base of politics in South Africa belongs to the NEC of the ANC, because ultimately they decide who gets to be the president of the country. Now, Bossa has called for the direct election of the president of the country. I want you to walk us through how the recall process would work should citizens in a new electoral system not be happy, not be satisfied with the performance of a directly elected president of a country. I think that's the first thing, because you've spoken about, direct officials being accountable to the populace on the ground. But what happens if the populace is not happy with these officials who've been directly appointed? The second thing is that, going back to the youth, whose job is it to educate the youth on the electoral system? Is it the IEC? Is it Bossa? Political parties? What specifically has Bossa been doing? Because, again, we've got to get the youth army to go out and vote.
Well, there's no doubt about the issue, and certainly the work that we do is to make sure that in the manifesto process and in the drafting of the manifesto process, you make sure young people's voices, because you can't write what you don't understand, so you educate them in that regard so that they are able to mobilize and deal with these issues. As you know, the bulk of my work is spent in high schools and it's spent fighting for education, and in many ways, I try and spend enough time with matriculants to say, this is an electoral system you can have, and this is how the process can work. And through other formats, we're working hard. Even I really do believe that were South Africa to adopt the system, then the mandate could be given directly to the IEC to say, go now and educate the citizens, because they certainly are not going to understand how to vote. And it was poorly done the last time when the process of allowing people who are potentially independents to stand, the IEC did a poor job, in my view, of educating and preparing the electorate. Now, on the question of the recall of the president, we've said, even on this panel, no system is perfect. And whilst I accept the fact that there may be a deficient way of directly mobilizing or directly recalling the president, but as you've seen in jurisdictions like the US, who have in some form a constituency-based model to some extent, what you then do is that through the representatives of the people, let Parliament or a National Assembly be able to ultimately say, through a motion of no confidence, because those two provisions in Section 89 and in Section 102, given that they're able to mobilize enough signatures or enough activism from their own communities to say the president must be removed, it would then be common cause that Parliament would have to move on that on the basis of both the petitions mechanisms, the petitioning of the members of Parliament to be able to remove. But part of you almost in some ways can't have it both ways. If you ask the citizens to vote for the person, they need to realize that their vote must mean something. So they can't experiment with it to some extent and be like, well, we're going to try you for a few months, and if we don't like you, we'll try someone else. Because the threshold of the candidate then must improve who is directly elected. And also the powers that are enshrined in the Constitution follow that same person, so that once you buy it, you must in some ways know that it's got to be with you at least for 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, you can create a system where you are constantly confusing voters and asking them to say through their representatives in Parliament, who may come from different parties, different constituencies, to now suddenly have a referendum on the president on a regular basis. The advantage of having a directly elected president, of course, outweighs the disadvantage, which is the disadvantage I've just pointed to now. But the advantage is this: once they have a mandate from the people, they must fear the people. They must know whatever the promise they made, that's what they've got to deliver on. And the job that they've got to do is working with Parliament and our legislative forum that they're able to advance that agenda. So that must become part of what we do. And then maybe in some ways, to the Van Zyl-Slabbert report and many, you can get a combination of what is proportional and what is constituency. And of course, normally, in that instance, when people have voted for President X, they generally have to also figure out what MPs they want in there, so that you don't end up with a lame duck president who can't pass laws through parliament.
Thank you everyone for joining us. If you enjoyed today's podcast and found it interesting, please remember to click like and subscribe below. And then until next time.